Eleanor Ashford clutched her worn leather suitcase tighter as the stagecoach bounced along the rutted trail. Her heart raced in sync with the rhythmic pounding of the horses' hooves against the hard-packed dirt. Outside, the landscape was vast, endless and barren, wide stretches of brown prairie broken only by jagged mountains on the horizon. The dust from the road clung to the air like a veil, and the heat pressed down like an oppressive weight. It had been a long journey from her quiet hometown in Kansas, a place where every day seemed like a repetition of the last. She had dreamed of this new life for months, hoped for it even longer. She had answered the advertisement in the local paper. A modest promise of a fresh start for a woman willing to become a bride in the untamed West. The photo of Samuel Ashford, the man who had written the letter, had been simple but kind, with a rugged smile and the promise of stability in a world that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable to her. "Come to Ashford Ranch, and I will offer you a life of purpose," Samuel had written. And though she hadn't expected romance, she had expected peace. A life free from the shadows of loss and the isolation of small-town Kansas. Her stomach churned, with nervous anticipation as the stagecoach lurched to a halt. The driver's voice broke through her thoughts, gruff and impatient. "We're here. Ashford Ranch." Eleanor took a deep breath, adjusting her bonnet and smoothing down the wrinkles in her faded dress. She stepped down onto the dirt with tentative steps, unsure if the earth beneath her feet was as solid as it seemed. The town of Redstone Ridge stretched out before her, its lone saloon and a few scattered buildings barely visible in the late afternoon light. There was no bustling main street like she had imagined, only a few scattered souls and horses tied. 2 posts. The air smelled of dust and sweat. Her gaze landed on Samuel, who was waiting at the edge of the town, his broad frame silhouetted against the setting sun. His dark hair and beard looked like they belonged to a man hardened by years of hard labor and living on the frontier. The weathered face that looked back at her held a quiet warmth, but there was a wariness in his eyes that made her pause. Samuel stepped forward and held out a hand to help her with her suitcase. "You made it," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Welcome to Redstone Ridge, Eleanor. I'm Samuel Ashford." His hand was calloused but firm as she shook it, a touch of hesitation still lingering in the air. "Thank you for your letter," Eleanor replied, her voice quieter than she intended. "I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm here." He smiled, though there was something about the smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was a man of few words, but Eleanor could sense the burden he carried. His life had clearly been lived hard and alone, and though he had offered her a chance at a new life, there was something in his gaze that spoke of caution, a warning that perhaps not all was as it seemed. "This town's not much to look at," Samuel continued, shifting his weight and glancing around at the empty street. "But it's home. Let's get you to the ranch. There's work to be done." Eleanor hesitated for a moment, taking in the raw simplicity of the place, the dusty streets, the dry heat, the harshness of the land itself. It was so different from the clean-cut, organized life she had left behind. Yet, she had made her choice, and she was determined to make the best of it. She nodded, and together, they began the walk toward the ranch. The streets were quiet, almost unnervingly so, save for the distant sound of a dog barking and the occasional hoofbeats echoing in the distance. As they walked, Samuel spoke of the land he owned, the small ranch just outside of town, where he raised cattle and tried his best to carve a life in this unforgiving land. He told her that the town itself had a sheriff, though most folks didn't rely on him for much. Lawlessness was a way of life in Redstone Ridge. The town, it seemed, was as much a wild frontier as the land surrounding it. Eleanor listened intently, her mind buzzing with questions. Why had Samuel chosen this place? Was it the promise of land, of opportunity? Or was there something more lurking beneath the surface? She couldn't deny a deep sense of unease, an instinct that told her this town wasn't just lawless in the way of unpoliced streets, it felt lawless in its very soul. When they arrived at Ashford Ranch, Eleanor was greeted by the sight of a modest farmhouse and a barn in decent shape. There was a garden of sorts, though it looked like it had been neglected for some time. A single horse stood in a paddock, lazily grazing. Everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet. Samuel showed her around, introducing her to the tasks that would become part of her daily life. The ranch was small, but it was enough to sustain them both, if she worked hard. Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of her decisions sink in. This wasn't the life she had imagined. It wasn't the life of the romanticized frontier she had read about in books. No, this was a hard, unforgiving life. But it was hers now, as night fell, and they shared a simple meal in the dimly lit kitchen. Eleanor found herself staring out the window, her thoughts drifting back to her family, her old life, everything she had left behind to come here. Was it too late to turn back? Prizing ease, feeding the chickens, tending the small garden, and learning how to handle the horses. Samuel was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience, teaching her how to keep the ranch running. She worked beside him, and though they rarely shared personal details, an unspoken bond grew between them. But no matter how hard she worked, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in Redstone Ridge. It was a town suspended in time, like a place forgotten by civilization. There was no bustle, no sense of community, just a handful of weathered souls clinging to the edges of existence. The Saloon, the town's only real building of significance, was the heart of Redstone Ridge, a rickety structure with a sagging porch and peeling paint. It served as the gathering place for the few townsfolk who remained. Most of the time, it smelled of stale whiskey, tobacco, and sweat. It was a place where men drank to forget the barren landscape outside and the emptiness that filled their lives. Eleanor made the trip to town a few times, mostly for supplies. She'd tried to keep to herself, but it didn't take long for her to realize that the town was nothing like the place she had imagined. The people didn't seem to have much hope in their eyes, just a quiet resignation, as though they had long since accepted that they were at the mercy of forces beyond their control. It was clear that lawlessness was more than just a state of affairs, it was the town's way of life. There was no sheriff, and the handful of men who made up the so-called law were too corrupt or scared to do anything about it. There was talk of a man named Clayton Razor Duval, a notorious outlaw, who controlled the town through fear and intimidation. He and his gang of Rough Riders had their hands in everything: gambling, cattle rustling, and worse. One afternoon, after Eleanor finished her chores, Samuel asked her to go into town to pick up some supplies. It was a rare request, and she was hesitant. Samuel had told her little about the true nature of the town. The way he spoke of it, it seemed as though he was more resigned to it than anything else. She knew he wasn't afraid, but there was something in his silence, something he wasn't saying. "Be careful in town," he said as she mounted the horse, his gaze lingering on her a little longer than usual. "There's trouble brewing. The folks around here have learned to look the other way." Eleanor nodded, trying to reassure him with a smile, though his warning echoed in her mind as she made her way toward Redstone Ridge. The ride into town was short, but it gave her time to consider the strange unease that had settled over her since her arrival. When she reached the town, she tied her horse to the post outside the general store and walked inside. The air smelled of salt pork and stale bread. The old man behind the counter barely looked up as she entered, his hands shaking slightly as he sorted through a pile of dry goods. "Afternoon," Eleanor said, trying to sound cheerful. He nodded, grunting in acknowledgement. The town felt empty. Its streets and buildings were ghostly quiet, as if they were merely relics of a time long gone. A few men sat on the porch of the saloon, their voices low and murmured. They eyed Eleanor with barely concealed interest, sizing her up like she was a curiosity rather than a person. The shopkeeper slowly made his way over, a wary look in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, almost apologetically, "you might want to be careful in town today. The Duval gang's been around." Eleanor frowned, trying to mask her confusion. "The Duval gang," she repeated. The old man glanced nervously at the window before leaning closer. "They're trouble. Been around for years. They've taken over the town, run it from the saloon, and make sure folks don't step out of line. Don't make eye contact with any of them, and keep to yourself. You don't want to attract attention." Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine as she nodded. It wasn't the first time she had heard the name Duval, but hearing it from a local confirmed what she had already suspected: this town was ruled by fear. It wasn't a place where a woman could feel safe on her own. The quiet dread in the shopkeeper's voice made it clear that Duval and his men were the real power in Redstone Ridge, and no one dared defy them. As she gathered her supplies, she kept her eyes on the floor, making sure not to draw attention to herself. When she stepped outside, she glanced over at the saloon, where the gang seemed to be gathered in full force. Men lounged on the porch, laughing too loudly, drinking too freely. At the center of it all was Clayton Duval, a tall man with cruel, calculating eyes. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, but there was no mistaking the coldness that radiated from him. One of his men, a stocky fellow with a scarred face, glanced over at Eleanor, his lips curling into a smirk. Eleanor quickly averted her gaze and made her way back to her horse. The man's eyes followed her every step, and she could feel the weight of his stare pressing against her skin, as she mounted the horse and rode back toward the ranch. Her heart pounded in her chest. The sense of unease grew stronger. The town was no longer just a place she'd come to build a new life, it was a place filled with danger, and she had no idea how deep it ran. Samuel was right. There was trouble brewing in Redstone Ridge, and no one seemed brave enough to do anything about it. It was a day like any other in Redstone Ridge, or at least that's how it started. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dry plains as Eleanor finished her morning chores. She had grown accustomed to the ranch's routine, the early morning milking, the feeding of the horses, the constant maintenance of a piece of land that demanded respect if you were to survive it. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was a life. And for the first time since her arrival, she was beginning to feel a sense of belonging in the rhythm of the land. But that morning was different. There was an ominous stillness in the air, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. Samuel had left earlier, as he often did, to tend to some business in town. He'd told Eleanor not to expect him back until late afternoon, perhaps even after dark. The days were long, and the work in the fields was never ending. But that didn't worry her. Samuel was a man who could handle himself, no matter what Redstone Ridge threw at him. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. By noon, she found herself pacing in the small farmhouse, her thoughts drifting to him. She told herself it was foolish, that he would return when he was ready. But the anxiety gnawed at her, the silence in the house becoming unbearable. She couldn't shake the image of the men she had seen in town, the leering gazes of Duval's gang. Was Samuel really safe in a town run by criminals? She had no idea, but she had begun to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake by coming here. The sound of hooves breaking through the stillness interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor's heart skipped. She rushed to the window, praying it would be Samuel returning from town. But instead, her eyes caught sight of something far worse. A lone rider, hunched over in the saddle, covered in dust, riding at full speed toward the ranch. It wasn't Samuel. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. As she recognized the rider, it was Eli, the man Samuel had told her about. He worked at the saloon and was one of the few people in town who seemed to care enough to offer a word of warning. But the look on his face as he approached was anything but reassuring. When Eli reached the front of the ranch, he didn't dismount immediately. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Eleanor," he gasped, his voice shaking. "It's Samuel. They've got him." A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She felt as though the ground beneath her had suddenly dropped out. "Who's got him?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce. Her mind was already racing, thinking of the worst possible scenarios. Was it Duval and his gang? Had they come for revenge for something Samuel had done? Duval's men, Eli said. Clayton Duval himself, and a few others. They took him just outside of town. Said they were gonna teach him a lesson. He fought back, but he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The horror in his eyes told Eleanor everything she needed to know. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "The kill," Eli finally said, the words heavy and final. Eleanor felt her legs go weak beneath her. She stumbled back a step, her hand clutching the doorframe for support. Her world spun, the air around her thick and suffocating. Samuel, her husband, the man who had brought her to this godforsaken place, was dead. The life she had just begun to build was shattered in an instant, like glass falling to the ground. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, it can't be." But it was. The weight of Eli's words hit her like a tidal wave, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The room around her blurred, and she closed her eyes, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. Eli moved closer, his hand trembling as he reached out to her. "I'm sorry, Eleanor, where is he?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice hard now. The rawness of her grief had transformed into something cold and determined. "Where's Samuel?" Eli hesitated, unsure of how to answer. They left him out there, on the edge of town. A warning to anyone who thinks they can stand up to them. I don't think you should go out there, Eleanor. It's dangerous. Duval's men are still in town. They'll kill you too if they catch you." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She didn't care about danger, about the men who would stand in her way. The only thing that mattered now was that Samuel was gone, and she was going to make sure that his death wasn't in vain. "I'll bury him," she said, her voice steady despite the fury boiling inside her. "And then I'll make them pay." Eli opened his mouth to argue, but he stopped himself. looking down at the ground in silence. He knew there was no reasoning with her now. A fire had been lit inside her, a fire that couldn't be extinguished by anything short of blood. Without another word, Eleanor grabbed her shawl from the hook by the door and rushed outside, mounting her horse with hands that were shaking, but with a resolve that was undeniable. Eli, too shocked to stop her, watched as she rode off toward the edge of town. World around her was no longer the place she had arrived in just weeks ago. The town that had seemed so quiet and remote now felt like a powder keg, ready to explode. And as Eleanor rode through the barren landscape, heading toward the spot where Samuel's body lay, she knew this was only the beginning. Eleanor buried her husband at the edge of the ranch, just beyond the small patch of land where Samuel had planted his crops, a quiet, unremarkable spot in the wide expanse of the wilderness. The earth was dry, hard, and unforgiving, just like the life they had tried to build here. She hadn't spoken since Eli left her to tend to the grave. Her hands had moved automatically, shoveling dirt over the body, burying the last remnants of the life she had hoped to start. It wasn't a proper funeral. There were no prayers, no solemn speeches, just the harsh sound of dirt hitting wood. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, her sorrow had been replaced by something darker, sharper, anger. Eleanor had spent the entire night sitting at the edge of the grave, staring into the darkness, her thoughts a whirlwind of vengeance. Samuel hadn't deserved to die like that, not alone, not in a town where men like Clayton, Razor Duval ruled with impunity. No more when she rose from the grave the next morning. The soft light of dawn barely touched her features, casting her in a cold silhouette. She was no longer the timid mail-order bride who had arrived in Redstone Ridge just a few months ago. The quiet woman who had dreamt of a peaceful life with her husband was gone. In her place stood a woman who had nothing left to lose. She spent the next 2 days preparing, gathering supplies, cleaning the rifle Samuel had kept locked away in the barn, and sharpening her resolve. She knew the people of Redstone Ridge would either be too afraid or too complicit to help her. But there was one thing they couldn't take away from her, her thirst for justice. By the third day, Eleanor was ready. She donned the same dress she'd worn when she first arrived in town, the pale blue one that Samuel had commented on when they met. But this time, it wasn't an outfit for a woman about to start a new life. This was the uniform of a widow seeking revenge. She strapped the rifle to her back, tucked a handful of bullets in her waistband, and took a deep breath as she stepped out onto the porch of the farmhouse. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of dust and dry sagebrush. The same scent that had greeted her upon her arrival now felt suffocating. The town, just a few miles away, felt like a distant memory, but in her heart, she knew she had to face it again. Eleanor mounted her horse without hesitation, the same steely determination in her eyes that had once seemed so foreign to her. She wasn't sure how she would find Clayton Duval, or where she would start her hunt. But she knew one thing for certain: she would make him and his gang pay. By the time she reached the outskirts of Redstone Ridge, Eleanor's heart was pounding in her chest. The town was quiet, but it felt alive with menace. The familiar rickety buildings seemed to close in on her as she passed them, the empty street echoing with every hoofbeat. She noticed the men on the porch of the saloon watching her approach, with cold, calculating eyes. They knew who she was. They knew what she was coming for. The saloon was a few paces down the street. She didn't slow as she neared it, her gaze fixed on the swinging doors, the familiar creak of the wood only adding to her mounting tension. As she dismounted and tied her horse to the post out front, the men from the porch stood up, eyes narrowing. "Look who's back," one of them sneered. His grin was crooked, filled with malice. He was the same man who had stared at her with that unsettling gaze when she first arrived. He wasn't laughing now, though. Eleanor ignored him, her face as hard as stone. She pushed through the saloon doors, the interior dark and smoke-filled. The noise of the bar died down as she stepped inside, and all eyes turned toward her. Most of the patrons were familiar faces, the same ones she had seen lingering in the background on her trips into town. Their glares and whispers following her every move. At the far end of the room, seated at a table covered with cards and whiskey bottles, was Clayton Duval himself. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered with a jaw as sharp as the edge of a knife. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned her as she entered, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of recognition. Well, Duval's voice was a low, gravelly drawl. "Looks like the little widow has come back to town. What brings you to our humble establishment, ma'am?" His smile was slow and predatory. Eleanor's fingers brushed the stock of the rifle strapped to her back. She was calm, Collected though inside, a storm was raging. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm here for you, Duval," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "And for your men." The room fell into an unnatural silence. The men at the tables watched with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. Duval's eyes flickered over to the men standing by the door, signaling them to stay back. "You're here for me," Duval chuckled, standing up slowly. "You must be confused, sweetheart. What can a little thing like you do against a man like me?" Eleanor's hand went to the rifle. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to show Duval that she wasn't playing games. She met his gaze with an unyielding stare. "I'll make you pay for what you did to Samuel," she said, her voice colder than the room itself. "Every last one of you." Duval's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He wasn't intimidated, not yet. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "You killed my husband," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "And now, I'm going to make you regret it." The tension in the saloon thickened, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, her heart steady, her thoughts razor-sharp. The oppressive silence stretched, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet echoing like a countdown. Duval was smiling again. His grin stretched too wide, his eyes glinting with that cold, predatory gleam. He was accustomed to controlling the room, to striking fear in those who crossed his path. But Eleanor wasn't afraid. She was here for something far greater than fear, justice. "I'm sorry for your loss, sweetheart," Duval said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. He took a step toward her, his boots heavy on the floor, and Eleanor stood her ground. "But that's how things work around here. You want to survive in Redstone Ridge, you gotta pay the price." The room was filled with Duval's men, their eyes narrowed, watching closely. They had no respect for a woman who would walk into their lair uninvited. But they didn't know Eleanor. "I'm not here to survive, Duval," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm here to make you pay." Duval's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, the shift imperceptible to most, but Eleanor felt it. He wasn't sure if she was bluffing, but the glint in her eyes told him she wasn't. "You think you can stand up to me?" Duval asked, his tone hardening, a tinge of real menace creeping in. He reached down to draw a long, scarred knife from his belt, flicking it open with a practiced motion. "You're not in charge here, sweetheart." Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply watched him with cold eyes. She had no intention of letting him intimidate her. "You're wrong," she said, her voice unwavering. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Duval sneered, stepping closer, the blade catching the low light of the saloon. "You're out of your league," he said. "I don't need to lift a finger to make you regret this." Eleanor didn't respond. She wasn't here for words. She knew that talk would get her nowhere. She knew exactly what would get her justice. Action. As Duval lunged toward her, swinging the knife with a vicious arc, Eleanor sidestepped, the blade missing her by inches. Her breath was steady. She wasn't afraid. Quickly, her hand went to the rifle she'd secured on her back. Her fingers tightened around the stock, and in a smooth motion, she leveled it at Duval. The saloon fell into dead silence. Duval froze, his smile slipping as he realized that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't the one in control. "Put that down, woman," one of Duval's men called out, his voice laced with a mix of fear and aggression. But Eleanor didn't flinch. Her focus was solely on Duval. "I'm not here for a fight," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "But I'll do what it takes." Duval's eyes darkened, the arrogance fading from his face. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "If you think you can walk out of here alive, you're wrong." The tension was unbearable. The men in the saloon shifted uneasily, none of them willing to make a move. They all knew who Duval was, the razor, but Eleanor was different. She wasn't backing down. For a moment, there was stillness. Then Duval took a slow step back, realizing that any wrong move could be his last. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said, his tone dark. "But don't think you're the first to try to stand up to me. And you won't be the last." Eleanor didn't move, didn't blink. Her eyes never left him. "You killed my husband," she said quietly, the words cutting through the air, like a knife, "and I'm going to make you pay for it." The silence that followed was heavy. It was a silence filled with the unspoken knowledge that Duval's power was crumbling. He was no longer the kingpin of this town. She was. Men began to shift uneasily, glancing at each other, at the woman with the rifle in her hands. They knew her reputation now, and it was growing. You've made your point, sweetheart, Duval said, stepping back, his voice tense, betraying the flicker of doubt that had entered his mind, but you're still outnumbered. Without saying a word, Eleanor lifted her rifle just slightly, the intent clear in her steady gaze. The message was clear. If it came to that, she would not hesitate. The men in the saloon stood back, unsure of how to proceed. They saw Duval, the man who had ruled them with fear, now rattled by a woman who had nothing left to lose. Duval's sneer faltered, and for the first time, he was no longer certain of his victory. The man who had killed without remorse was now the one being judged. Eleanor's grip on the rifle tightened, but she didn't move to fire. She simply stood there, waiting, watching, as the room held its breath. Finally, Duval's resolve cracked. His anger boiled over. But the knowledge that he had been bested by a woman, the very idea that she had come here to destroy everything he had built, forced him to reconsider his next move. The room, the men, the saloon itself had all shifted. He realized that the town of Redstone Ridge would no longer be his. Without another word, Duval turned, a mix of anger and defeat on his face. He called out to his men, signaling them to back down. The gang had lost its leader, and they knew it. The power Duval had once held was slipping from his grasp. Eleanor didn't lower the rifle until the men had scattered, leaving her alone, in the saloon, standing over the fallen kingdom of a man who had lost it all. Her heart was still racing, but the fire in her eyes was stronger than ever. This was just the beginning. Redstone Ridge was quieter than Eleanor had ever seen it. The saloon doors, which once swung open to welcome the roughest and rowdiest men of the town, now stood ajar, the faint smell of stale whiskey and sweat lingering in the air. The once voices of Duval's gang were hushed, their spirits crushed under the weight of the events that had unfolded just hours before. Eleanor stood outside the saloon, her rifle now resting against her shoulder as she looked down the empty main street. Her pulse still thrummed with the adrenaline of the confrontation, her mind racing. She hadn't come here to play games, and she had made that abundantly clear. But the true cost of what she'd done was starting to sink in. The moment she had killed Duval, she had taken a step that would change everything. The fragile balance of power in Redstone Ridge had shattered, and there would be consequences. A cold wind whipped through the dusty streets, stirring the tumbleweeds and sending a chill through her bones. Eleanor glanced around, half expecting someone to ambush her, but there was no movement, no sign of life. The men who had once dominated the town were nowhere to be seen, their absence palpable. They were hiding, waiting for someone else to take control, but Eleanor didn't need them to show themselves. She knew exactly what had to be done. Inside the town's makeshift jail, a single candle flickered in the dark corner. The cell was small and damp, but it was the only place the town's lore lack thereof had to offer. A lone figure sat, hunched over, his head in his hands, as though he were trying to forget the nightmare that had just unfolded. It was Sheriff Frank Graves, a man whose badge had long since lost its meaning. He was an old man, bent by the years and weighed down by the town's many sins. He had done little to keep order in Redstone Ridge, letting Duval and his gang run rampant, knowing that doing otherwise would likely cost him his life. Now, sitting alone in the cell, he was the last man standing who could potentially stop Eleanor. The rest of Redstone Ridge knew it, but Sheriff Graves wasn't sure what he could do. He had seen the woman in action, seen the coldness in her eyes when she put Duval down, and the terrifying calm she'd carried herself with afterward. Eleanor wasn't afraid of him. She didn't care about his badge, or his warnings. She had made up her mind, and once a person like Eleanor made up their mind, there was no stopping them. Graves was a coward, and he knew it. His hands trembled as he reached for the iron bars of the cell, staring out into the empty, silent town. Eleanor's footsteps echoed on the wooden porch of the sheriff's office as she approached. She didn't knock. She didn't have to. She knew the man inside would be expecting her. As she entered the small, dimly lit office, the old sheriff looked up at her with a resigned expression. "I figured you'd come for me eventually," Sheriff Graves said, his voice hollow. "Guess I'm your next target, huh?" Eleanor didn't speak right away. She just studied him, this tired man who had allowed the town to fall into the hands of criminals, who had let innocent people suffer for years while doing nothing. This man had been the law. This was the man who was supposed to protect her husband. Graves shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under her gaze. "You don't have to do this, Eleanor," he said, his voice pleading. I didn't kill your husband. Duval did, and I never wanted it to go this far, but I was never strong enough to stand up to him." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You never stood up to him because you were scared. You didn't want to lose your job, your power, your life. She let the words hang in the air, her voice steady, but cutting. My husband didn't have that luxury. He wasn't the one who could sit idly by, letting people die at Duval's hand. He was the one who fought. Sheriff Graves swallowed hard. He had no response. He didn't deserve one. The silence between them stretched, and for a moment, Eleanor almost felt pity for the old man. He was a coward, but even cowards could feel guilt. You've got a choice. Eleanor finally said, her voice low but firm. You can stay here, hiding, while the town falls apart. Or you can step up and make it right. Help me take control of Redstone Ridge. Help me make sure what happened to Samuel never happens again. Graves didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his weathered hands, wrinkled with age and hard labor. He had spent so many years sitting back, hoping someone else would save them all. But there was no one else now. Eleanor stepped forward, her hand on the handle of the cell door. You still have a choice. But make it quick. People like you don't get second chances. She didn't wait for him to answer. She turned, her boots clicking on the floor as she walked back, out of the office and into the cold, silent street. Later that evening, Eleanor returned to the center of town. She stood tall on the porch of the old, dilapidated town hall. The place where the town's leaders had once gathered to make decisions. The wind howled around her, the cold of night setting in as she scanned the empty street. It was then that she saw them people from all over Redstone Ridge beginning to emerge from the shadows. Their faces pale and uncertain, but they were watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. Eleanor stood tall, holding the rifle loosely in her hands, but she was no longer the timid woman who had stepped off the stagecoach months ago. She was the law now. She wasn't here to plead with them or ask for their allegiance. She was here to lead. I'm not here to negotiate. She called out to the crowd, her voice cutting through the night air. I'm here to make sure this town is safe. From now on, we don't answer to men like Duval. We answer to justice. And that means we answer to me. The silence that followed was heavy. But then, slowly, the people began to move. A few men stepped forward, their expressions wary but willing. Others, women and children mostly, lingered at the edges, their fear evident in the way they watched her. But Eleanor didn't care. She was the one who had taken control. She was the one who would make sure Samuel's death meant something. No one was going to take this town back from her not without a fight. The sun had barely risen over Redstone Ridge, casting the town in a pale amber light. The streets, once dominated by chaos and fear, now felt quieter, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm was the undercurrent of something much deeper. Change. Eleanor stood in the center of the town square, her silhouette outlined by the first rays of dawn. She had spent the last few days meeting with the townspeople, making sure that the promises she made were more than just words. They needed to see that she was the kind of leader who wouldn't just talk about justice. She would deliver it. The people of Redstone Ridge were tired of being afraid. They were tired of living under the rule of men like Duval. They had seen enough bloodshed, enough lies. Eleanor wasn't just a figurehead. She was the symbol of something new. A new order. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to find Sheriff Graves walking toward her. His once dreary face now held a weary but resolute look. His eyes, however, were softer than they had been the last time they'd spoken. He wasn't the man he used to be, and Eleanor had made sure of it. I'm not a young man anymore, he said, his voice steady but laced with the weight of years gone by, but I'm willing to do what's right. If you'll have me. Eleanor nodded, her gaze unwavering. I don't need a man who's afraid to act. I need someone who's willing to stand up, even when the odds are stacked against him. You've got it in you, Graves. You just have to remember who you used to be. Graves took a long breath, his eyes still downcast, but when he looked back at her, there was no fear left in him. Only determination. I'm not afraid anymore, he said, meeting her eyes. I've been given a second chance. I won't waste it. Eleanor nodded again. Then we do this together. We make sure that no one walks into this town thinking they can take what isn't theirs. She walked past him, the weight of her resolve sinking into the ground beneath her boots. As they made their way toward the town hall, the people gathered in small clusters, watching them closely. They had heard the rumors, the whispers, and now, they were seeing it for themselves. The town was changing. Inside the town hall, Eleanor took her seat at the old wooden table where decisions used to be made by men who had no idea what it meant to truly lead. The dust in the air was thick with history of failed attempts, broken promises, and people who had once tried to fix a town that was beyond saving. But Eleanor was different. She wasn't going to sit idly by. She was going to take action. Sheriff Graves sat beside her, his posture straight, his eyes fixed ahead. Across the table sat a handful of town leaders, business owners, ranchers, farmers, and a few of the local tradesmen. They had all come, each with their own doubts, their own concerns. But they had come because they recognized something in Eleanor. She wasn't there to fight for power. She was there to ensure the survival of a town that had nearly torn itself apart. "I don't care what kind of men Duval left behind," Eleanor began, her voice firm. "We are taking back control of this town. That means no more deals with criminals. No more letting the law be bent to suit the needs of men who think they're untouchable." One of the ranchers, a stocky man with a grizzled face, shifted in his seat, his gaze uneasy. "And what do you expect us to do when they come back? When Duval's gang shows up again, ready to claim what they think is theirs?" Eyes hardened, her hands resting on the table as she leaned forward. "We don't wait for them to come. We make sure they never get the chance. We're not sitting around, hoping for salvation. We're building it with our own hands." The room fell into silence. They were all listening now. For the first time, they were beginning to understand what she was offering. Not just safety but a future. One where they weren't constantly living in fear. Graves cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of the room. "We'll need to rebuild the town's infrastructure. The law will need to be solidified. We'll need more men, good men. And a lot of hard work." Eleanor's gaze flicked to him, then to the others gathered around the table. "I'll get the word out. Anyone who wants to stay, who wants to make this town into something worth living for, will be welcome. And if anyone thinks they can just ride in and take control again, they'll find that things have changed." She paused, letting the words sink in. The idea of change wasn't just abstract. It was concrete. It had a face. It had a name. Her name. By the time the meeting ended, the people of Redstone Ridge were no longer a passive audience. They were ready to work. They were ready to fight for what had been taken from them. Outside, Eleanor stood beneath the clear blue sky, the weight of the decision she had made sinking in. The town was hers to lead, but it wasn't just her vision, it was the vision of everyone who had suffered, who had fought beside her. She had merely lit the spark. She turned to Sheriff Graves, who had followed her outside. "It's not going to be easy," she said quietly. "There's still a lot of work to do." Graves nodded, his face lined with the experiences of the past. "I know, but at least now, we have a chance. And we won't back down." Eleanor's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the mountains loomed in the distance, silent and eternal. It felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. The grief, the loss, it would always be there, but now, there was purpose. "We'll rebuild this town," she said softly. "But it'll be on our terms, and we won't let anyone take it from us again." With a final glance at the street that stretched before her, Eleanor knew that her work had only just begun. Redstone Ridge would rise from the ashes of its past. And this time, it would stay standing.